A quick heads up before today's episode that I have another free workshop coming up on the 26th of February. It's called Resonate, and in it we are going to craft messaging that ignites action takers. If you know your messaging could use with an up level, make sure you register now at tashcorbin.com/resonate. Today's episode of the Heart Centre Business Podcast kind of comes from a listener question, but kind of also not. Let me explain. So whenever I do podcast episodes about webinars, I get a bunch of questions about webinars afterwards. And I've had quite a few people after a previous podcast episode about webinars send me in a lot of different questions, but they're actually all asking the same question in essence. So the types of questions I have been asked are things like, what do you think about the strategy of offering a bonus resource to people if they attend my webinar live? Or, hey Tash, do you think it's a good idea if I do a prize draw for live attendees who come to my webinar to maximize the number of people who come? Or, hey Tash, what do you think about webinars with no replay so that people have to actually come and watch it live? Now, in essence, every single person is asking me, how do I maximize attendance at my webinar? Now, they're asking it through the lens of, should I do this to maximize attendance or should I do that to maximize attendance? And so I thought I'd lump them all into one juicy, tangible, practical episode of the podcast on how to maximize attendance at your webinars. So this is episode number 461, which means you can find all the relevant links and the show notes of today's episode over at tashcorbin.com/461. Let's dive in and get your webinar attendee numbers skyrocketing. Hello, I'm Tash Corbin, a business strategist and mentor based on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. The mission of this podcast is to help heart-centered entrepreneurs to make more money and in doing so, change the world for the better. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so first and foremost, a big shout out and thank you to every single person who sent me this form of question in some way, shape or form. You know who you are. Thank you so much for all of your questions. I really do love when you ask questions for me to answer in the podcast. It makes podcast content planning so much easier, and it also helps me to ensure that this podcast is really valuable for you. If you have a question that you'd like to ask me, because webinar episodes often beget more webinar episode questions, but also if you have a question about anything really in business, behind the scenes, about me, about launching, whatever it might be, feel free to check out the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/461. I'll have a link for you to go and ask a question. So we want to maximize attendance at your webinars. Now, there's a good reason for this. We want to have more people come to your webinar live because, number one, it's great to have lots of people in the chat box and asking questions, and it gives it a real good vibe, and it also makes it feel, I think, a lot more connecting and engaging for you as the presenter. But also we know that the more people who attend a webinar live, the more conversion you are likely to have into whatever your offer might be at the end of the webinar. But also, the more people who attend your webinar live, the bigger the connection you have with those people. So the more you fast track the nurture stage of your client attraction process. So the client attraction process is reach people, then we nurture a relationship, you get to know them, they get to know you, then you invite them towards potentially purchasing an offer, and then conversion, they end up purchasing. So that nurture part of the client attraction process is one that a lot of people struggle with, especially in the early stages of their business. And we often default to doing things like just creating a ton of one-way content and just like screaming at people through the internet. Whereas nurture is about getting to know your audience as much as they get to know you, and, you know, delivering value as much as they ask you questions. Peeking behind the curtain there, I just told you to come and ask me a bunch of questions, didn't I? So there's a lot of value in having people attend a webinar live, well beyond the fact that it has a direct correlation with conversion. But that is one of the big reasons why we want people to come to your webinar, because the more people who complete the webinar, who attend, who either watch it live or watch the replay, the more likely they are to then go through that bridging process and identify whether working with you is the next logical step for them or not. So of the strategies that I mentioned in the intro, which of those are the best to maximize live attendance at your webinar? So should you bribe people with some kind of bonus for attending live, or a resource that they only know what the link is if they either attend the webinar live or watch the replay all the way to the end? Or should you do a live attendee prize draw? Is it better to go without offering replays? Which of these strategies are actually effective at maximizing webinar attendance? Now, it might surprise you that I'm not actually going to argue with any of these strategies. Yeah, it's true. If you don't have a replay, people will set aside the time and watch the webinar live more than if you did offer a replay. It's true. If you have a live attendee prize draw, it can get more people to attend your webinar live. If you bribe people to attend your webinar with some kind of bonus resource that only live attendees get access to, or you put the information about the bonus resource at the end of the webinar so they either have to attend live or watch the replay. Like, all of those things do work. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. And there are other things that I think you absolutely should be doing to maximize live attendance. For example, promoting your webinar at least 2 weeks out, giving people ample time to get it into their calendars, especially your hottest audience. Give them time to actually have space in their calendar. If you keep surprising people with webinars at the last minute, you're going to reduce live attendance. I also think it's very important to have your reminders in place, and how far out and how often you send those reminders actually differs depending on your niche. So if your audience are the kinds of people who are on their emails very consistently, then I would sway towards less reminders and make those reminders closer to the actual webinar. So, doing one the day before and then one 30 minutes before the webinar, for example. But if people aren't on their emails regularly, then doing, the 3 days before and then the day before and then an hour before. I usually don't do any more than 3 reminders. Those things do definitely help people to remember about the webinar and attend the webinar live. I also, when I run webinars, have a really easy add this to your calendar thing. So people actually block the time in their calendar at the right time, because I give them the ICS file to be able to do that. Now, my team set that up. I don't know how to create ICS files, but those things definitely work, right? So all of these things absolutely work. And some of them I think are just basic fundamentals that you want to do for every webinar. I would definitely say getting your reminder strategy sorted and paying attention to which reminder levels and intervals work for you and your audience. Similarly, experimenting with time of day and day of the week can definitely make a difference. It's less of a difference than most people will try and lead you to believe, but it does make a difference. And then also, making sure that you're promoting it plenty of time out and making it easier for people to put it in their calendar and work out what the time is. Those things definitely, just do those every single time. But also, before I move on, another big one, open your webinar 5 minutes before the start time. Now, I'm not saying start the webinar 5 minutes before the start time, but we live in a short attention span, ADHD, very easily distractible world. And a lot of people go and open a webinar a few minutes before. They like to be there on time, or they notice, it's starting soon, so I'll open it up. And if you have them open it up and then it's not started yet, that doesn't do anything yet, they don't hear anything yet, you're maximizing the chance they're going to get distracted, they're going to go and make a cup of tea and forget, and they come back and the webinar's 15 minutes in and then they can't actually, get into the webinar because they missed the most important bit at the start, right? So you do want to make sure that you get some of those things nailed. Absolutely. But when it comes to like the bribery tactics, that's where I start to question, what's the real problem here? Because if we're trying to maximize webinar attendance, we want to use strategies that don't actually fudge the numbers. Yeah? Because if we want to maximize live attendance, because live attendance maximizes conversion and connection and fast tracks nurture, then I actually think the number one reason you want people coming to your webinar live is actually they are super dang excited to attend the webinar. They're excited for the topic. They're excited to learn from you because they've learned from you before or they've heard you speak about this before and they absolutely ate up every morsel of what you were sharing. This is something that's a priority for them. It's something that they're excited to get their teeth into. It's something they've really struggled to sort out. And the fact that you're offering a free webinar for them to actually be able to sort it out, that's the number one reason I want people to attend my webinars live. I don't want people attending my webinars live for the chance to win a free one-on-one session with me. If that's their number one reason for attending live, my webinar topic is off. Or that person's not my ideal client. Or I haven't actually hit the mark with speaking about the value of attending the webinar from the topic perspective, from the outcomes of watching the webinar perspective. So you may be surprised to know that I don't measure the success of my webinar by live attendance alone. I always look at live attendance plus replay watches, because I also know that for some of my best ideal clients, my most likely to convert leads, my most itching to learn about this topic and dive into further work with me people, they can't attend the webinar live. And they will be hungrily waiting for the replay email to go out so they can watch it that night. They will email me the next day if the replay doesn't go out within a few hours and say, hey, where's the replay? I think I signed up for this. Has the email gone out already? Right? And so I actually don't necessarily think that it has to be live attendance in order for it to be valuable attendance in terms of return for my business. And I also want to ensure that the people who are watching my replays feel the love and get just as much value from my webinars as the people who do attend live. Now, one of the things I can't replicate from live attendance versus watching the replay is the ability to ask me questions there in the call and clarify things as you get to them. But when I send out the replay, I always encourage people, if in watching that question comes up, just reply to this email and ask me. That's totally fine. You couldn't attend live. I'll happily answer your question on email. So my number one measure of completion of my webinar is actually how many people attended the webinar live plus how many people watched the replay. I'm much more interested in that number than I am in just the live attendance number alone. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of marketers and people who teach webinars in particular will really force this live attendance thing is because they will often do that like bypass people having time to think about the offer, make them buy live on the call by having an offer that's only available to people live on the call, right? And this is something that is not necessarily a consent-based marketing practice. It's something to be very mindful of. You know, that is a pressure tactic. It's a manufactured urgency that bypasses people making an informed and well thought out decision about whether to buy something and whether it's the right fit for them or not. And so therefore, I don't actually use that methodology in my webinars. And so that's why live attendance isn't as big a factor for me compared to live attendance plus replay viewership. So if I have 100 people sign up to a webinar and I have between live attendees and people watching the replay, 75 people have either attended live or watched the replay, I'm a happy camper, right? Like that's a very high completion rate for a webinar. And if it's 15% of people came live, but 60% of people watched the replay, I'm not too bothered by that because I know that my replay watch rate is very high. I know that I tend to attract marginalized people. I tend to attract people who may not have the capacity to watch live, or they're in a job, or, you know, there's lots of different reasons why they can't watch live. They prefer to watch the replay because they can pause and take notes, because they have, processing capacity issues, or, they really want to be able to stop and focus and think about things before we move on to the next point. You know, there's lots of different reasons why people prefer to watch replays. So if everyone's hungry and excited to watch the replay and there's less people there live, I'm less bothered by that. So I just wanted to note that when I talk about that. So really, let's have a think about this now, right? So are you wanting to use those manufactured strategies to get people to attend your webinar live because your topic's a bit off and you're actually like wallpapering over some big cracks in your foundations? Or are you wanting to use those strategies because you're afraid no one's going to turn up, and there's some mindset stuff we probably need to work on there? And would it actually be better for you to not use those bribery type approaches and those fake urgency and scarcity approaches in order to ascertain, have you actually nailed this webinar? Have you done a good job of expressing the value proposition of the training itself? Have you connected with something that is relevant and timely and urgent for your audience and something they're really excited to do with you? Now, the other thing I do want to say is that sometimes those bribes can be a turn off. So especially if your audience are entrepreneurs, they've been in business for a little while, they've been around the block, we see those strategies and we know that you're going to force us to sit through 16 testimonials in a row disguised as, if this person can do it, so can you, in order to get that bribe, that resource. And so for me, if I see people offering webinars with those bribes attached, like either there's no replay, not inclusive, or if you attend live, you'll get a resource that non-live attendees won't get. You have to force me through your webinar, like in order to get that resource. Or there's going to be a webinar only offer and you have to buy it then and there, not consent-based practice, right? For those of us who've been around a while, those strategies are actually a turn off. They speak volumes about either your willingness to bypass my consent in order to maximize your profits, or your lack of inclusion in your business model, or your lack of belief in your content, or the way that you run your webinars, the way that you structure your content is going to be so mind-numbing and so salesy that you have to resort to bribing me to stay to the end of the webinar. One of the worst things someone can say at the start of a webinar for me is, and make sure you stay to the end of the webinar because, right, I actually do the opposite. At the start of my webinars, when I explain how the webinar is going to unfold and what I'm going to talk about, I openly say And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to let you know about how we can do more of this together in my takeoff program. But if that's not something that's of interest to you or it's not the right fit for you, you don't need to stay for that part of the webinar because there's no extra carrot dangling afterwards. If we get to the end of the core content and you do not want to hear about the takeoff program, you do not need to stay. You don't have to worry that you're going to miss out on something because I don't do that to you. Now, I want you to think about that from a buyer perspective. Which of those two strategies has you leaning in and feeling a sense of safety in your nervous system more? Is it, make sure you stay to the end of the webinar because I've got this amazing bonus and only people who stay to the end can get it? Or is it, hey, I'm going to talk to you about an offer at the end of this webinar, but if it's not something that you're interested in hearing about, you're welcome to jump off. You won't miss out on anything. I know which one I'd rather hear, and I know which one I'd rather say. And so many people don't adopt this strategy because they're afraid. So many people don't adopt this strategy because their webinars are terrible and they wouldn't make sales if they didn't use the bribes. So many people need to force feed their testimonials and their pitch throughout their webinar at you so hard that they have to resort to this kind of strategy. In fact, I've even seen people so afraid that people won't stick around for the offer at the end that they say the offer at the start of the webinars now. And they're like, well, before we get into today's topic, here's my sales pitch. Here's my sales pitch. Before you've even learnt anything, before you even know whether I'm going to be a good fit for you, like I want you to hear the sales pitch and how spectacular it is because I don't trust that you're going to still be here by the time I'm done teaching. That speaks volumes to me. I don't know about you. Now, I already did touch on this a little, but I want to overtly say that marginalized people are less likely to be able to attend live or less likely to have the capacity to attend and absorb a webinar live. And so for me, the whole don't offer a replay strategy is not one I would subscribe to. It's not inclusive. It's really important to me that I have a very inclusive business because I am neurodivergent. I am marginalized. I am marginalized in a range of different layers, not only because I'm a woman, but also because I'm neurodivergent and also because I have been excluded from being able to access certain resources and certain advantages over the years as a business person throughout my education as well as especially in early days of my career. And so therefore, it's important to me that I ensure I have an equitable and inclusive approach to the way that I run my business. So I always offer a replay and I always ensure that that replay has controls on it. So another strategy that I've seen that forces people to sit through all of the sales pitch of the webinar and that first 15 minutes of you talking about yourself is they offer the replay of the webinar, but all the controls are unavailable. They don't work. So you can't pause it. You can't rewind. You can't fast forward. You can't skip ahead. You can't, swipe through the slides. You can't even watch it in double time. And you can't even see how long the webinar goes for, right? The little timing thing is often gone on the screen. So you don't even know what you're strapping yourself in for. Again, this is a non-inclusive process. As someone who tends to listen to webinars on the go, I need to rewind and re-listen to points here and there. Sometimes I'll want to pause so that I can write notes down. That's your most engaged listener. And you're so afraid that if you don't force people to listen all in one go and take away people's ability to pause it, you're so afraid that if you don't take away the control, you won't make as many sales. It's a bit cringe. It gives me the ick. right? But this is taught, right? And I'm not saying anyone who's ever done any of this not to blame at all, because this is what is taught. There is a very well-known, very widely regarded launch training and a very well-known, very widely well-regarded webinar training. Both of them teach this stuff. And so, a lot of people will say to me when I'm talking this and unpacking these strategies, they're like, oh my goodness, I feel so bad. I feel so guilty for having done this. I'm like, no, it's not your fault. You were told to do this, but you were told to do this through the lens of fear. And you were told to do this through the lens of forcing people. You were told to do this through the lens of bypassing consent. And it's not your fault if you believed that this is just how you do things. It's not your fault that you were told that this is the best practice. It's not best practice. It's most forceful practice. And, I'd never do this, but I absolutely would bet you that if I ran a webinar and I used all of those strategies and bypassed people's consent and forced them to come and watch the webinar and all of those sorts of things, I absolutely believe my conversion rate overall would be lower than doing it the consent-based way. Now, I know and I accept and acknowledge that my conversion rate often takes a little longer, right? So if my webinar is the first time anyone's ever come to a webinar of mine, they are probably the least likely to convert in that launch, right? In that first 2 weeks, because I'm not forcing the decision and I'm not creating this false scarcity and false urgency kind of thing. But I also know I have a much lower unsubscribe rate. I have a much longer average length of time that people stay on my mailing list. And I also have a far lower refund request rate than across the industry for marketing and business strategy programs and offers. Far, far, far lower. Like I'm talking my refund rate would be less than 10% of industry averages. Like for every 10 refunds they get, I get 1 refund request. So for me, that speaks volumes about the fact that I'm not creating buyer's remorse. I'm not pushing people into buying something that they don't want or need or that isn't a good fit for them. I have far more trust in my audience. I have far less burn and churn of my audience as well. So I need to spend less on audience growth because my audience sticks around much longer. And rather than forcing people to make a decision whether to buy or get off my list within the first 15 days, I give people the time to hang around and I help people to feel really valued as a member of the community and see how much valuable information I share for free and really get to know me as a provider over a longer period of time. And I'm 100% happy with that choice. So if I was to switch up and start using those fear-based strategies and those pressure-based strategies, I actually don't think my conversion rate would be as high overall. I think I'd have to spend more on list growth because my list would be churned so much faster. I still to this day see people talk about during their launches, when they have a bunch of people join their list during a launch, that they expect to lose 25 to 40% of those people from their mailing list within that 60 days of their launch. My leads, when I do ads to get them onto my mailing list, cost me between $1.20 to about $5.80 a lead to get them onto my mailing list. And to then have 40% of those people disappear within 60 days because I spammed them, I would feel like, well, I just wasted my money because the reason they've unsubscribed is that I've overwhelmed them or I've put too much pressure on or I'm just sending far too many emails. And if I didn't do that, which I don't do, for me, I have people on average stay on my mailing list for over 2 years. And I've only been using my current program, my current platform for my mailing list since 2017. So I've been using it for 8 years. So the longer I use that platform and I'm staying on the same platform, the longer the average time that someone is on my mailing list, because I've only got 8 years of data, even though I've been in business for almost 12 years now. So I went a little tangential there, but hopefully you can appreciate that, there's a lot of finessing to webinar strategy, and I want to make sure that I address a lot of the but Tashes that I would normally get from people when they first hear me talk about like not buying into some of that fear-based rhetoric. Okay, so let's make a decision to stop fudging the numbers with these bribes and some of those strategies that are forcing people to watch your webinars. And instead, let's just get a better strategy, hey? Let's get a better strategy. So yes, we want to ensure that we get those reminders out, and make sure that when you send your reminders about the webinars that people have signed up for, that you reiterate the value proposition of that webinar. You don't just say, hey, reminder, the webinar you signed up for, it's tomorrow. And I get so many email reminders like that for webinars. I'm like, what was that webinar about again? And like the topics even in there, the webinar called Magical Manifesting is on tomorrow. And I'm like, what was that again? Why did I sign up for that, right? And it's generally because there was something on the sign-up page for the webinar that really landed for me, or something in the promo, but I don't get that in the reminder email. I just get, it's on tomorrow. Make sure you come. And so like be mindful of when you're writing those reminders that we get a lot of information. We sign up for a lot of stuff. And so just because you're sending me a reminder and I already signed up doesn't mean like I was definitely going to be coming and I had prioritized it already. And it also definitely doesn't mean that I'm going to absolutely remember why I signed up for that webinar and what it was that kind of appealed to me. And so make sure that for the love of all things, that you do ensure that you are putting the time and energy into the messaging of those reminders, rather than just like dialing them in and using a copy-paste template that someone gave you. Yeah. So tell us about why we should come live beyond the bribe. Tell us about what difference it will make in our lives. What are we going to implement? What are we going to learn as a result? What are you going to actually help us to resolve or achieve? Remember to include that in all the spaces where you have an opportunity to remind us to attend live. Now, also, when I say reminders, I also include in that posts on social media that remind people. So even though someone's signed up to attend your webinar, doesn't necessarily mean they're opening all your emails. I'm sorry, they might not open all your emails. So make sure that on your socials the day before you're saying, oh my gosh, the webinar's on tomorrow. Can't wait to help people with X. This is a really important foundational part of this overall goal that we are achieving. I try and every time I have a webinar do it's a webinar day, yay! And I talk about a little bit about what the webinar is about. Or I might even do like, it's webinar day, see you all at 10 a.m. Who's coming as the post? And then in the comments, I'll say, if you're reading this and you completely missed it, or you forgot about what the webinar is about, here's the details, here's the link to register. It's not too late. Even if you see this after the webinar is on, you can still sign up and grab the replay. So, just make sure that you are being a good cheerleader and champion of your webinar, and not just the generic, the more specific part of the messaging and that value proposition. We want to have a strong topic that people get excited about, that is actually meeting someone's needs, that people are hungry to get help with. So, really want you to ensure that you're not just, dialing it in on the topic, and that you are listening to your audience and learning from what works and what doesn't. Build your reputation as a great webinar facilitator. I have people say, over and over again, doesn't matter what the topic is, if it's a Tash Corbin webinar, I'm signing up for it. And that's really beautiful for me to hear. And also, I think that speaks volumes for the effort and the energy and the diligence that I put into my webinar creation. I also, when I create a webinar, I'm absolutely creating it as a lead generating and conversion generating strategy for an offer. Every webinar that I run has an upsell of some sort, but I always craft my webinar through the lens of I want every single person who watches this webinar to feel it was a good use of their time, regardless of whether they buy the offer or not. That is always the intent and the lens through which I create my webinars. And that has got me a great reputation as a webinar presenter and a webinar deliverer. So, this takes time, and this takes needing to do webinars consistently and growing your audience to build up that relationship and that reputation. But I think it is something not to be underestimated. There are people who I discovered online because friends recommended them, or it came up and said that someone that I really respect liked their page or whatever it might be. I saw a webinar promo. I went to the webinar and I have never, ever engaged with that person's content again. I have unsubscribed from their list straight away, and I have, never bought anything from them, and I will never buy anything from them because I attended their webinar and they wasted my time. They wasted my time. They did not deliver on the thing that they said they were going to deliver on in the promos. The thing that they said they were going to deliver in their webinar was the magical secret thing that was in their upsell. And that is a dodgy way to do business. And I feel really ripped off, and I feel like you've wasted my time. And I don't care how good your offer is. I don't care how good your delivery is inside that paid offer. You wasted my time. And that tells me that you are unafraid to waste my time. And that might be my experience inside your course. And so I ain't buying. You're going to waste my time with your emails. You're going to waste my time with your content on socials. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to consume that content anymore. So we really want to make sure that we are building your reputation as a deliverer on your promise. Now, as I said, we do sometimes want to experiment with day and time. That's probably a 1%er. I definitely think, particularly for live attendance, making sure that you open the webinar a few minutes early. I try and open at least 5 minutes early. And I just say, it's 5 minutes before we're actually going to start, but introduce yourself in the comments. Let me know where you're joining in from. I will, say people's name as they enter the webinar room and really acknowledge them for being there live. And before I started doing that, I just had enough people say, oh my gosh, I opened it up and I was it was saying that it was starting soon. And then I went to the bathroom and I got distracted and I did a load of laundry and then I made a cup of tea and then it was 20 minutes in. And so I was it's too late. So I'll have to watch the replay. And I just had enough of that happen and enough people say that to me that I decided to start my webinars a little earlier and open the room a little earlier. And it has definitely made a big difference to my live attendance. I don't get those messages anymore. Overall, let's just stop buying into the fear and really discern what is the mindset stuff and the fear stuff that's coming up for you telling you. Maybe it is that your topic isn't really that great. And instead of avoiding that harsh reality and bypassing it and fudging your numbers with bribery, let's just be honest. I don't know if my webinar is really that interesting and exciting to people. Or I don't really know that I've really nailed the value proposition of the webinar. I know that people want the outcome and I know that people want this type of training, but I just don't know how to talk about how valuable that is in a way that people get it really quickly. Well, that's really good insight. That's really good self-awareness. And that's something we can fix. But if you aren't willing to face up to the reality of your real numbers without the bribery and the trickery and all of those dodgy tactics, then you may never get that insight. You may never have that realization. So when it comes to maximizing webinar attendance, my absolute number one piece of advice is focus on making the number one reason people attend and watch the replay be that they're really pumped for the topic, that they're really excited to actually grab that content of yours. They're really excited to learn that from you. And if we focus and put that front and center, the effectiveness of your webinar, the upsell from your webinar, which is why you want people to attend, right? The conversion, the trust that you build, the relationship that you build, the fast tracking of the nurture, all of those benefits are there for you without you having to resort to that trickery. And also, it can significantly improve your longer term retention rates, not only on your list, but also with clients. You're lowering refund rates a lot of the time as well with those upsells. So that is episode number 461 of the Heart Centered Business podcast. I hope that you found that really, really helpful. And I invite you, if you have a question for me, a follow-up question about webinars or a question for me about other strategies that maybe you've heard and now you're starting to think, is this a fear-based strategy or is this actually good advice? Make sure that you come over to the show notes at tashcorbin.com/461. Follow the link, submit your question, and I'll be able to answer on a future podcast episode. Thank you so much for joining me for this one. And until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now.